Oh, it's not you. I promise.
I've never been particularly bothered by works not adhering to the established lore or canon of their particular franchises. I feel that devotion to the specific details of a setting, rather than adapting a setting's details to the narrative being told, more often detracts from artistic works. Many people delight in digging into specific histories and details of a fictional world, and I feel much the same at times, but I'd argue overall that it is better a setting adapt to suit an artistic work, rather than the work twist itself to fit into the specific setting. Canon should exist as a guide, not a prison. Many of these established settings are large enough to allow for a wide variety of stories to be told in them, and if the broad strokes of a setting fit into the narrative being told, there's no reason it shouldn't be used, even if some of the details are changed in the process. This is of course easy for me to say of worlds I don't particularly care about, but what of the ones I do? While I don't really consider myself a fan of anything, I tend to be skeptical of fandom in general. I do love the world that Tolkien developed for The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I'm no Tolkien scholar to be sure, but I'm familiar enough with the setting and care a great deal about it. How then would I feel about a pair of games that drastically alter the details of the setting or shift the tone and style of the narratives already established there? In this regard, today we're going to be looking at two games by Monolith Productions set in Middle-earth, namely 2014's Shadow of Mordor and its 2017 sequel, Shadow of War. Christopher Tolkien became literary executor of the Tolkien estate following his father's death in 1973, and was majorly responsible for much of the additional material released since then, such as The Silmarillion and Unfinished Tales. He reportedly wasn't a big fan of the Peter Jackson film adaptations released in the early 2000s, citing them as being too action-focused and not really tonally representative of the original work. I dread to imagine what he would have thought of Shadow of Mordor, which takes the tone and aesthetics of those films and doubles down on the action and violence, and caps the whole thing off with an unhealthy dose of dark edginess. It does try to lighten the mood at times. The opening sequence includes teaching Talion's son swordplay as a combat tutorial, and sneaking up on his wife to give her a kiss as a stealth tutorial, but after that it's the attack on the Black Gate, so Talion can be captured and forced to watch as a group of Sauron's followers slit his wife and son's throats before his own, as part of some dark ritual that binds him to an ancient elven wraith. Already we've breached established lore. In the Legendarium, the Gondorian defences of the Black Gate ended after it was abandoned due to the Great Plague over 1,000 years before the events of the films. Here it falls in a sudden assault by Sauron's forces not long after the events of The Hobbit. I'm not going to point out every inaccuracy in the lore because then we'd be here all day, but I'll talk about some of the fun or interesting stuff. This kind of change is perfectly understandable anyway. Shadow of Mordor plays relatively generically. It's got one particularly interesting mechanic in the form of its Nemesis system, but other than that, structurally and mechanically, it's very similar to other works. Movement and stealth are like a simplified Assassin's Creed, combat is a cross between Assassin's Creed and the Batman Arkham games, the overall world structure is very much like standard Ubisoft open worlds. It uses these pre-existing mechanics as a basis to build upon the more specific elements that make the game unique, and it treats the setting in much the same way. Middle-earth is a backdrop. The broad strokes are enough to be recognisable to anyone casually familiar with the setting, similar to how the mechanics are going to be recognisable to anyone casually familiar with games, but the specific details are changed, shifted around, or even ignored completely, the difference being the hardcore fans are more likely to be upset by the changes to the setting than to the mechanics. These details that fans get so upset with changing are also things that don't really matter that much. Whether the Black Gate falls in an assault on an underprepared garrison, or falls 1,000 years earlier to a plague doesn't actually have any major effects on the setting as a whole, so shifting these details to better suit the story being told is reasonable. Amazon's Rings of Power series does something similar. So far it has been advancing plots regarding the forging of the Rings of Power, the destruction of Numenor, the fall of Khazad-dûm, and the arrival of Gandalf in Middle-earth at the same time, despite the fact that, in the Legendarium, these events all took place over the course of about 3,000 years. If an adaptation wants to cover multiple events, then the timeline needs to be shifted. I'd agree that using the setting to tell completely new stories would be preferable to this, but people equally get upset when works in a familiar setting contain no recognisable elements. The broad strokes of the setting matter, Sauron, Mordor, the Rings, but the details can be changed without affecting previous works, without upsetting the narrative. Canon should be a broad set to be drawn upon, not specific details to be restricted by. Tone, on the other hand, is a little more difficult. I'm still in favour of works that may share a setting but differ in tone, in much the same way The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion do, but I realise that Shadow of Mordor's tone shift is a little more radical than that. In adapting to a different audience and a different medium, the game is much more action-focused than even the Peter Jackson films, and focuses much more on the darker themes of the overall setting, while introducing dark themes of its own. Vengeance, for example, is a major driver of the plot throughout. Talion, of course, seeks vengeance against the trio of Sauron's lackeys who murdered his family and himself. Meanwhile, the Wraith of Celebrimbor seeks vengeance against Sauron himself, though the specific reasons for this seem to shift as the two games progress. Celebrimbor created the Rings of Power with Sauron's help, though at the game's outset he doesn't seem to remember who he is or how he became a Wraith, given that upon death, elven spirits are meant to move to the halls of Mandos, ready for reincarnation. Finding out the identity of the Wraith is one of your first major tasks when you're unleashed upon the open world. This also leads to one of my actual problems with the tone of the game. Several arcs of main missions can be progressed in any order, with each one usually focused on a specific mission giver, each totally separate from the others. While the tone of the game is dark overall, this constant switching between characters can lead to constant shifts in tone. Hergon was a ranger of the Black Gate until he deserted and joined with the outcast Gondorian who lived in Mordor before Sauron began to retake the land. He and Talion used to be friends and clearly still have a great deal of respect for one another. Their desperate attempts to fight back, to rescue his wife and the other outcasts before it eventually becomes apparent that they are doomed and need to leave Mordor, has a totally different tone to following Gollum around to find Celebrimbor's old stuff. Gollum doesn't particularly fit into the narrative. The reason he's in Mordor and why he knows the location of Celebrimbor's old stuff is vague at best, and his inclusion feels like needless fan service for fans who would already be annoyed by all the other changes to the setting. While Hergon's mission set fit well with the overall tone of the game, there's a sense of tonal whiplash when it switches to following a weird little guy singing his weird little songs while he shows you where Celebrimbor dropped his jewellery. Talion gets his own weird little guy throughout the first half of the game in the form of Ratbag. Talion repeatedly aids the orc in climbing the ranks of Sauron's army in exchange for information. Again, while Hergon feels like a darker story that would still fit into Middle-earth as a setting, it's presented alongside the bumbling adventures of the worst orc failing his way up the ranks with the help of his buddy. The comedic relief elements often feel out of place, which is a shame since it suffuses the Nemesis system so deeply. The Nemesis system is Shadow of Mordor's major claim to fame. While generic grunt orcs are pretty nondescript, higher-ranking orcs such as captains and the war chiefs that run each area have unique names, titles and personalities, complete with different skills and traits, strengths and weaknesses. These personalities can be memorable, but it's not uncommon to find orcs who are in some way goofy or comedic. It undercuts the threat of the Uruk hordes when you have to stop halfway through a fight for their captain to share a teaser for his latest Netflix special. This is especially unfortunate since otherwise the presence of a captain can force you to re-evaluate how you're going to deal with an encounter, making even common activities very engaging. Helping Hergon and the outcasts, all while murdering your way up the ranks of Sauron's forces, does eventually garner the attention of one of the three men you're looking for. The Hammer, the Tower, and the Black Hand are a trio of men, similar to the Mouth of Sauron. Despite their unique designs, they lack a lot of the personality of the orcs. The Hammer especially is just a big angry dude with a mace, but killing him does bring the wrath of Sauron's armies down upon the Valley of Udun, forcing Hergon's outcasts to finally flee Mordor, and Talion and Celebrimbor to travel south to continue their crusade in the lands of Nirn. Despite the darker tone, Shadow of Mordor aesthetically feels well at home within the setting of Middle-earth. Middle-earth as a setting has developed a strong visual identity due to the history of artists working within it. many artists over the years who produced work based upon Tolkien's stories and world, but two of the most influential were John Howe and Alan Lee. The detailed work of Howe and the ethereal paintings of Lee were both fan favourites amongst artwork based on the world, but they were each heavily involved in concept artwork of the Peter Jackson films, and so their visions of Tolkien's work have long since become the culturally accepted aesthetic of Middle-earth. This has the drawback, however, of creating an expectation of how the world should look, and works that deviate from that are often seen as weaker. At the same time, no work can ever truly have the impact of the original so long as it's drawing from its influence. Unless another vision of Middle-earth becomes more popular, every subsequent work is doomed to be compared to the work of Howe and Lee, where it will be found wanting, either for being too derivative or for deviating too far from it. Shadow of Mordor falls into this gap, both by matching the aesthetic while making it darker, but that shouldn't detract from the quality of the artistry on display. Udun was more or less what you might expect of Mordor, a barren wasteland dotted with ramshackle outposts and some larger ruined citadels. It's well designed and looks good, but its counterpart, Nirn, is genuinely gorgeous. Nestled between a range of mountains and the vast inland sea of Nirnen, it's a green and verdant land, spotted with the ruins of ancient Gondorian outposts, as well as the more recent wooden structures and strongholds of the Corsairs of Umbar, though the people who built both are no longer present. It's a great inclusion, and is the kind of thing I love from works in established settings. Visually distinct from established norms, a new area and set of ideas that haven't been explored elsewhere in the world, all while being reasonably well integrated into the lore. As the only major piece of fertile land in Mordor, Nirn acts as the main source of farmland for Sauron's armies. The scale and design of the area fits well into Middle-earth as a whole, but it's also an unexpected inclusion given its location. It feels like it expands the world in a meaningful way, rather than simply repeating pre-existing elements like Gollum, or remixing them like they do with Marwyn. When Talion first meets the Queen of the Shore, she's ancient and decrepit, suffering from some unspecified affliction, but still able to provide visions, leading to more of Celebrimbor's artifacts, as well as coaxing the pair to begin dominating their own army of orcs. Each time you meet Marwyn, she seems even weaker, until finally she tries to steal Celebrimbor, and is only stopped when her daughter breaks her staff, restoring Marwyn's health and mind. The Lord of the Rings is full of elements that exist as echoes of elements from the Legendarium. Aragorn and Arwen's romance is an echo of Beren and Luthien's, for example, but Marwyn's possession by Saruman is a straight recreation of Theoden's possession. Instead of evoking the feeling and memory of another story, deepening the feel of historical connection within the setting, it's simply pointing at something that already happened and saying, hey look, remember that thing, which is far less engaging, even if it is arguably better than the direct but nonsensical inclusion of elements such as Gollum. To the game's credit, it does a better job of this in other areas. There are aspects throughout that feel reminiscent without feeling imitative, such as the strained camaraderie between Hergon and Talion, or the designs of the Black Captains. Marwyn and her daughter represent one of the major sequences of quest givers for the game's back half, and are notable for introducing the game's most unique mechanic. While in Udun you murdered your way up the Orcish ranks, in Nirn you take a marginally more subtle approach. Using Celebrimbor's powers, you begin to dominate orcs, bending them to your will instead of Sauron's. This begins as a way to convert a few orcs to your side before a fight, but quickly evolves into subjugating your own set of captains, and eventually making them the war chiefs of Nirn, building your own army. Nirn doesn't have a weird little guy to give you missions, instead you're building your own army of weird little guys, adding a new layer to the Nemesis system and expanding the scale of the encounters to include far more combatants. As you take more captains for yourself, you'll even start to see an increase in the number of orcs allied with you out and about in the world, and even start encountering skirmishes between your and Sauron's forces. Eventually your forces are strong enough that you can cross the Sea of Nirnen to face the second Black Captain, on your own terms. While human, each of the three captains are representative of some part of Sauron. The hammer, whom you defeated at the climax of Dune, represented Sauron's physical power, but here you fight the tower, whose embodiment is his more subtle, sorcerous acts. The fight isn't much more engaging than the hammer's was, a stealth challenge to sneak up on various manifestations of him around his stronghold within a time limit, but he does reveal an interesting twist. Throughout the game, the relationship between Talion and Celebrimbor has always been strained. They share a common goal, defeating the Black Captains, but they commonly disagree about tactics. Talion cares much more about aiding Hergon's outlaws and Marwyn's tribesmen. The fate of individual people matters to him. Celebrimbor, on the other hand, is far more concerned with gaining power, caring little about the effects it has on others. This creates an uneasy alliance. They're frequently at odds about how to proceed, about what is and isn't a waste of their time, but they will often reluctantly agree to the other's plans. Celebrimbor's search for power does aid Talion in helping the people who still call Mordor home. Meanwhile, helping those locals does strengthen them and create a more powerful ally to weaken and distract Sauron. This friction develops into a building sense of tension between the two, which all comes to a head when the tower reveals that the two aren't bound together by any curse of Sauron or the Black Captains. Talion hasn't been banished from death like he thought. Celebrimbor is keeping him alive, and could have let him die and return to his family at any moment. Talion is just a tool to Celebrimbor, like the orcs, a less disposable tool, one that requires more diplomacy in using, but a tool nonetheless. Celebrimbor bound himself to Talion because he believed Talion's desire for revenge would lead him to supporting Celebrimbor's own quest. He offers to free Talion after they defeat the tower. Whether or not this is a serious offer is unknown. Exactly how ruthless Celebrimbor can be is yet to be determined, but he also offers a different path. The last of the captains still remains, and despite his misgivings, Talion isn't a man to leave a job half-finished. The Black Hand doesn't get the same build-up as the other two captains did. Each of them had an entire zone of Mordor to fight your way up before facing them, but the final captain, though he's been narratively referenced throughout, is dealt with the mission after dealing with the tower. He also doesn't get much of a boss fight. The mechanical climax of the game comes shortly before facing him in a pitched fight between you and your war chiefs against the Talons of the Black Hand, a group of 5 powerful Uruk captains. It's unclear whether the Black Hand is representative of Sauron's scheming and plotting, or whether he is literally a physical aspect of Sauron himself. Either way, Sauron manifests his physical form briefly upon facing him, stealing Celebrimbor from Talion. Fortunately, before Talion bleeds out, Celebrimbor is able to temporarily hold Sauron in place, allowing Talion to defeat him with a series of quicktime events. It's a disappointing final boss, to say the least. Having defeated the Black Captains, Celebrimbor once again offers Talion his death. Their task is done, the rest is up to others. Talion declines. Sauron is still an active threat to Middle-earth, and together they still have a chance of facing him, but not as they are now. They have something Sauron doesn't, the Ringmaker himself, and Talion decides it's time for a new ring of power. The creation of a new ring isn't a bad cliffhanger to end it on, and the sequel will explore the outcome of that decision. The only misstep is it being Talion's idea. It doesn't quite track with his actions throughout the game, reluctant as he was to use Celebrimbor's powers. It would have made more sense for Celebrimbor to propose its creation instead, and prey upon Talion's desire to protect Gondor to convince him to remain to see the work done. This also would have fit in better not only with the narrative direction of the sequel, but with Celebrimbor's characterization in the DLC as well. The second DLC, that is. Celebrimbor doesn't appear at all during the first DLC, except in his capacity as a mechanical component of Talion's skill set. Lord of the Hunt takes place shortly before the end of Shadow of Mordor, after the defeat of the tower, but before facing the Black Hand. Talion is at the height of his power, but a new group of creature-themed war chiefs is moving upon Nirn, so it's time to learn some new abilities, face some new creature variants, and kill another group of orcs. Most of this is done alongside the dwarven hunter Torvin. Torvin featured in the base game in much the same way he does here. He teaches Talion about the different creatures of Mordor, granting access to abilities relating to them. The new creatures aren't all that exciting, variations on existing monsters. The stealth Caragor is about as dumb as it is hilarious, and raiding a camp with an army of ghouls is fun, but it's not a transformative inclusion to the mechanical toolset. What I liked about the DLC was the sense of casual camaraderie between Torvin and Talion. Writing for games is a difficult task. There's a huge amount of writing required, from cutscenes and gameplay dialogue to enemy barks and lore collectibles, but none of it has a great deal of time in the spotlight. The amount of dialogue characters get pales in comparison to that of film, let alone novels, so the primary focus is often on efficiency rather than depth. Both Shadow of games are actually very good in this regard, though their structures can weaken the level of player engagement with these aspects. The core loops are designed to encourage repetition and flow, open world design centered around ticking off completion checklists, which can lull the player into a pleasant but almost passive form of engagement. This often leads to paying less attention to characters and writing, leading to less engagement with games in general as artistic works, further enforcing wider cultural views, which is a shame. I'm not saying that the Shadow of games are as well written as the Lord of the Rings, obviously, but the games are adept at quickly and efficiently developing and communicating characters and their relationships for the player. Torvin starts out feeling like another weird little guy. He's bright and jovial at all times, taking jabs at Talion here and there, but at one point one of his barbs hits Talion a little too close to home, a comment about scars. Torvin quickly shuts up when Talion snaps back, gets serious, reveals that he too has lost people. Talion didn't even need to state that he lost people, but the quiet response of Torvin shows he understands quickly. He knows what Talion is going through, and is sorry for causing harm. It's only a few lines of dialogue, but the delivery conveys a lot of character, and the games feature moments like this across multiple characters in the base game and its sequel. In Lords of the Hunt, the relationship between Torvin and Talion feels well established. Talion can get a little impatient with the dwarf on matters he thinks are important, but it feels like there's a real bond of friendship between the two. Talion even relaxes into firing back some barbs of his own during the less dire moments, deepening that sense of camaraderie between them. This sense of camaraderie is central to the appeal of The Lord of the Rings, so it feels fitting to focus on it a little more. Talion has a rough time of it between the two games, and it is genuinely kind of nice to see him relaxed and interacting with a friend, rather than the more reluctant adversarial relationship he has with Celebrimbor. The added time with Torvin actually makes me wish we'd seen more of other characters in the base game. Hergon and Lithariel each have equally, if not more, interesting dynamics with Talion, but the necessity of the open world limits their interactions to a few main missions in favour of optional side content and the freeform hunting and dominating of orcs. The little extra development time with Torvin makes me wish we could have had more developed relationships and characters across the board, which is something the sequel would improve on, though not massively. At launch, I can see Lord of the Hunt being a short and disappointing inclusion to the game. As a bonus campaign included in the whole package, I appreciate the chance to experience the mechanical rhythms of the front half of the game in the environments of the back half, as well as a chance to spend more time in the more relaxed narrative space of Torvin and Talion's connection. The second DLC would be its mirror in many regards, a prequel DLC focused on Celebrimbor that brings the gameplay rhythms of the back half of the game to the environments of the front, and doubles down on a focus on conflict. Before it was even released, a major criticism of Amazon's Rings of Power from a certain subsection of the internet was that the elves didn't feel elfy enough. Nonsense though this argument may be, especially coming before the series had even released, it seems to hold a small amount of water at first glance. The elves of Rings of Power did seem less graceful, less ethereal than they did in the Peter Jackson films, but the elves of Middle-earth are a varied people, and Lord of the Rings only introduces a small number of their wisest and oldest. Elrond is old enough to have met the Valar at the conclusion of the War of Wrath that ended the First Age. Galadriel, meanwhile, was alive before the First Age even began, in a time before there was even a sun. It makes sense that they were the most regal and otherworldly of the elves, but the Legendarium features a great many elves with a great many more flaws than these two. While Celebrimbor in Rings of Power is merely a craftsman, obsessed with his work, tricked and distracted by Sauron to work on the rings, in Shadow of Mordor, and especially in The Bright Lord, Celebrimbor takes more after his grandfather Fëanor, who crafted the Silmarils. Arrogant, violent, and bringing ruin through his actions. Not that there's a great deal of time to engage with this version of Celebrimbor. Both the DLCs are very short, potentially lasting less than 2 hours depending on how completionist you are with side content, or how competent you are with the game's combat system. While a fair balance of that time in The Lord of the Hunt was spent with the interactions between Talion and Torvin, here Celebrimbor stands alone, so narrative content is slight at best, despite the shift in temperament. It's revealed in the main game that Celebrimbor briefly controlled the One Ring himself during the Second Age, and used it to rally an army to fight Sauron. The Bright Lord tells that tale, but it's not a tale of gradual corruption, of a slow loss of self until you ultimately cause more harm than good. Celebrimbor was arrogant and self-aggrandizing even before he had the ring, so he wastes no time subjugating the orcs to his will and building his own empire. The army building feels more like a conquest than it did back in the base game. Part of this is from the enemies. The Uruks of the Second Age are better organised and better armoured than the Third, so it feels like you're fighting a more organised force than a loosely distributed rabble. The major change, though, is that the towers that act as respawn and fast travel points are built during the missions, rather than simply running up to them. This gives an actual sense of gaining ground, as taking the towers unlocks the missions against the Warchiefs as well. Warchiefs are accompanied by captains that only appear in their missions too, making the fights against them more climactic. The campaign as a whole is harder than anything in the base game, partly due to the escalating numbers and strength of the orcs, but also due to Celebrimbor being weaker than Talion at his peak. The ring grants a special ability that's a combination of the three you had access to in the base game, but your general skill set is just a little weaker, which does make the conflict feel more desperate. This does of course lead to a confrontation against Sauron himself, mercifully both narratively better justified and not a quick-time event this time around. Sauron is a genuinely tough boss fight, harder than anything in the base game. 3 stages, one versus him, one versus your 5 warchiefs released from your control, and finally another duel with Sauron as he intermittently resurrects the dead orcs to face you at the same time. The result is a desperate struggle, gradually chipping away at a hugely powerful opponent while trying to juggle the chaos around you. It's a great fight, and feels intentionally reminiscent of the duel between Fingolfin and Morgoth in the Silmarillion. There's some who question how well versed in background lore the developers of the 2 Shadows games were, and though the sequel will make a huge number of changes to the lore, The Bright Lord gives a clear case that the dev team were definitely familiar with the Silmarillion, at times feeling tonally more in line with the high fantasy epic narratives of that book than The Lord of the Rings itself, which I definitely appreciated. The quest to learn more about Celebrimbor's past, who he was and his history played a major role in the base game, but at the peak of the DLC we see Celebrimbor taking hold of Talion from his own perspective. He remembers who he is, and he's eager to get back to his conquest. It genuinely makes it feel like Celebrimbor was just lying to Talion throughout the base game, just trying to manipulate him by pretending not to remember his past. Much like how some of the creature mechanics from The Lord of the Hunt would make their way into the sequel, The Bright Lord acts as a testbed for the narrative and structural changes the sequel would make. A stronger focus on open warfare, a better balance of combat difficulty, and Celebrimbor being a power-hungry maniac, potentially as dangerous to Middle-earth as Sauron ever was. I don't think anyone was expecting goth mummy Shelob to make an appearance in Shadow of War. Personally, I was even more surprised by how much of this video I'm about to spend defending her inclusion. At first blush, giving Shelob the ability to appear as a woman seems wildly out of step with established canon, but it's not as far off as you might initially think. Like the ambiguity surrounding a Balrog's wings, Shelob is described as taking the form of a spider, but this doesn't necessarily mean she is one. Her mother, Ungoliant, was a spirit who again took the form of a spider, though again, this implies the possibility for her to take other forms. It's also well established that children often have the abilities of their parents, albeit perhaps in lesser ways, such as the Dunedain retaining their long life as descendants of early Númenóreans, or Arwen's ability to choose between elven immortality or a mortal life, due to her father being descended from both elves and men, with Elrond having chosen to be an elf, and his brother becoming the first king of Númenor, itself granting the long life to the Dunedain. Shelob's own children in Mirkwood have the power of speech between themselves, revealed to Bilbo by possession of the ring. It stands to reason then that Shelob has access to the powers of speech and reason, more so than her children, and some form of magical abilities from her mother, so the idea that she can choose to project the form of a woman to interact with Talion is defensible within established lore, even if it isn't explicitly established. The problem is, this is arguing from within the text. Shelob doesn't really exist, so naturally she can have any power necessary of the narrative. It's easy to pick and choose elements from the established lore to defend it, just as it's easy to pick different elements to oppose it. The real question is whether Shelob's appearance in Shadow of War fits thematically both in the established setting and the game's own take on it. Again, I was surprised to find that overall I felt yes. The temptation of power, how it corrupts even good men, play a major role in both the game and the setting as a whole. Shelob takes on the role of a dark reflection of Galadriel, offering guidance and power to Talion in the form of visions of the future. The woman as temptress trope is a little played out at this point, but it's well executed. Talion's distrust of Shelob being overridden by his desire to use her visions to help save Minas Ithil, believing that he could use this power for good, acts as a microcosm of the themes of the game, the concept of the One Ring itself, and of course Talion and Celebrimbor's new ring. Mechanically speaking, Shelob's role is to take the new ring to depower the player for the opening act of the game. Shortly after the ring is crafted, Shelob kidnaps Celebrimbor and demands the ring from Talion in exchange for his return. She then directs him towards the siege of Minas Ithil, the breaking of which makes up the mechanical and narrative focus of the game's first act. Like the Black Gate, the Legendarium places the fall of Minas Ithil around 1,000 years before the events of the game, but unlike the fall of the Black Gate, the siege of Minas Ithil feels like a large-scale conflict taking place across multiple days. The level of escalation in the conflict from the first game is dramatic. Even the largest battles in Shadow of Mordor feel like small skirmishes in comparison to the Uruk-ravaged streets of the ruined city, and fights will only get larger and more dramatic as the game continues. Minas Ithil itself is a major change too. Its vast ruined streets and high rooftops lend themselves well to the game's traversal and stealth mechanics, while allowing generous opportunities to escape battles that get out of hand. It's visually much grander than anything appearing in the first game, the architecture fitting well with the exaggerated Romanesque aesthetic of Gondor established by the Peter Jackson films, while still feeling distinct from Minas Tirith. It's a little difficult to imagine it as a place people lived, but it's also characterised as little more than a frontier outpost, long since past its golden age, even before Sauron's hordes toppled the outer walls and took the lower and middle city. The siege is not going well when the player arrives. Gondorian forces have fallen back to the upper city, barricading the gates and holding out hope for reinforcements that aren't coming. Talion does what he can to aid the holdouts, but the city is ultimately doomed, and with it, so is Talion. There's still an underlying sense of hope during these early sections of the game. Despite the adverse conditions, there's a beautifully subtle warmth to Talion's interaction with the defenders of Minas Ithil. He quickly develops a relaxed affect with Idril and Baranor, building a great sense of mutual respect, and the potential for deep friendships with each, though also the sense that he's keeping them at arm's length. This is the most naturally human Talion has felt since the flashbacks of his life at the Black Gate, and his desire to save these people is believable, enforcing the tragedy that this desire, and the quest for greater power that entails, is ultimately what will doom him. Celebrimbor couldn't care less about helping the people of Minas Ithil, of course. He's more focused on gaining power, on fighting Sauron regardless of the cost. He's slightly more sinister, more aggressive than he was in Shadow of Mordor, though the shift isn't too dramatic initially, especially coming from the Bright Lord DLC. His motivation in Minas Ithil is one of the Palantir. Shelob reveals it's somewhere in the city, hidden by its steward. Celebrimbor doesn't care if the city falls, but the Palantir is powerful, and would be dangerous if it fell into Sauron's hands, so wouldn't it be better in his hands instead? The pair continue the trend of approaching the same goals with different purposes throughout the game, though the relationship becomes even more strained as each tries harder to pull the other towards their own goals. The duo's presence in Minas Ithil does initially prove beneficial. They're instrumental in pushing back a fresh wave of attack, and eventually with their help the city is even able to send a small force out to Cirith Ungol to try and destabilise preparations for future assaults. Accessing the caves of Cirith Ungol, as well as the city, gives the player as much room to explore in Act 1 as they did in the entirety of the first game. It's a very video gamey sequel in this regard. Everything about the original returns, but with more of it. More environments to explore, more variety in the Nemesis system, deeper skills and equipment systems, and of course more weird little guys. Actually, the first weird little guy is Gollum again, though his presence is much better justified this time around. The Lord of the Rings established that Gollum has some history with Shelob, so her sending him out to help Talion as a tracker makes more sense than him just showing up. It retroactively makes his appearance in the first game make more sense as well. Shelob is able to grant people visions, and Gollum is able to see them, so it fits that the dreams he claimed to be following in the first game were products of Shelob's power as well. Besides, he's a weird little guy, she's a hot goth lady, of course he's going to do anything she says, we've all been there. Despite Shelob's help, however, she's in the fight for her own reasons. Collectibles scattered throughout the world reveal her past. Like Ungoliant and Morgoth, she and Sauron worked together briefly. There's even some indication that there may have been a level of romance to the relationship. But like Ungoliant and Morgoth, the two eventually became enemies. When the forces of Numenor came to face Sauron the first time, he gave her up, claiming sacrifices had to be made. Displeased with being tossed aside so casually, Shelob slaughtered those who came to capture her and fled to the darkness of Cirith Ungol to plot her revenge. Helping Talion will lead her to it. Shelob gives him enough visions to help Minas Ithil, to give him hope, but not enough to save it. Despite defeating the war chief in charge of the siege, this ultimately results in the Witch King himself descending upon the city with the rest of the Nazgul in tow, though the city was doomed even before that. Shelob reveals a traitor within the walls, but didn't reveal their identity until it was too late. The steward, Idril's father, made a deal with the Witch King to provide him with the Palantir in exchange for Idril's freedom. The Witch King of course reneges on the deal, murdering her father, with Idril only escaping while Talion holds off the Ringwraiths, before being saved himself by the arrival of a new ally, an elven woman named Eltariel, sent by Galadriel to hunt the Nazgul. She saves Talion by murdering him and then fleeing herself, which is a hell of a way to make a first impression. With Minas Ithil fallen, Minas Morgul rises in its place, and Talion, Celebrimbor and Eltariel flee back to Shelob's lair in the hopes of reclaiming Celebrimbor's ring. She asks Talion, as she had many times before, what he's willing to sacrifice, reminds him that sacrifices must be made, then returns the ring to him without a fight. Celebrimbor is too blinded by the power of his ring to think anything of this. Talion assumes she is sacrificing the power of the ring, believing he must sacrifice his own humanity to save Gondor. He's half right. The truth is, Shelob could have saved Minas Ithil. She could have revealed the steward's betrayal earlier, but didn't. Giving Talion just enough power to almost save the city only leaves him with the certainty that he requires more power, power that will ultimately destroy him. Shelob never intended to keep the new ring for herself. She's already sacrificed Minas Ithil for her revenge, and now she's going to sacrifice Talion too. She knows the coming war will consume Talion, so she pushed him to a point where he would agree to that willingly. Celebrimbor gets what he wants with the return of his ring, Talion gets what he wants with the power to face Sauron. With the pieces in place, all Shelob has to do is wait for her own vengeance. Ring on hand once more, the pair regain the power to subjugate the orcs to their own will, and so their war against Sauron and the rise of the Bright Lord begins in earnest. It also happens to begin where it did the last game, in Nirn. Again, Nirn acts as a tutorial for the new conquest, mechanics, and the expanded Nemesis system. I didn't speak at great length about the Nemesis system in Shadow of Mordor for a couple of reasons. Partly because the sequel has more depth and complexity, but partly because I didn't interact with it all that much in my playthrough of the first game. One of the most important aspects of the system is when orcs kill the player. If they're a regular grunt, they get promoted to captain and gain a name and skills. If they were already a captain, they increase in power and will remember you the next time you face them. But while playing through Shadow of Mordor, I don't think I died more than a few times, so I never really built up a memory of any of the orcs. I killed most of them the first time I met them, and that was it. This led to a great moment towards the end of the game, though. There's a great scene in Season 2 of Andor. Cyril, a security officer who loses his job in an early incident with Cassian, spends the entire 2 seasons working towards avenging himself, obsessing over finding Cassian again, and when he finally has the chance to face him, Andor has no idea who he is. I got my own version of this when just before the confrontation with the tower, Shadow of Mordor brings out a horde of orcs headed up by your true nemesis, the orc you've interacted with most throughout the game. Something or other potlicker was mine, furious at me for setting him on fire at some point. No idea who he was, didn't remember fighting him. To add insult to injury, I don't have access to my recordings as I write this, so I can't even look up his name. But according to the game, we had a deep history. By being too easy, the game ended up limiting my interaction with one of its central mechanics. Shadow of War fixes this with the obvious addition of difficulty levels. By allowing the player to increase the difficulty, it encourages interaction with this system. Of course, on the other hand, dying too much can result in a spiralling increase in enemy levels that a player can't keep up with. Allowing the player to alter the difficulty to cater to their skill set ensures every player can properly engage with the system as intended. In my case, I'm particularly fond of the brutal difficulty. Separate from the general increase in difficulty of the other 4, Brutal sets enemy numbers, aggression, and damage at the highest of the other difficulties, but also sets the player's damage and the rate they charge their special abilities slightly above even the lowest difficulty. As a result, you end up facing truly fearsome opponents, capable of killing you in 2 or 3 hits, while still making Talion feel as powerful as the narrative intends him to be. It was probably a tad too difficult for me, actually. I died more in the first few hours of Shadow of War than I did in my entire playthrough of Shadow of Mordor and its DLCs, but all those extra deaths encouraged deeper engagement with the Nemesis system. This is especially good given the added depth of the system. Abilities, strengths and weaknesses have been expanded upon, larger Ologs have been included this time around, and there's a vastly increased number of personalities, even if I would argue a few too many of them still skew towards the comedic end of things for my tastes. Beyond the variety of the system, the interactions have been deepened too. Orcs can now ambush you, hunt you down for revenge against their blood brothers, sometimes even chasing you between maps. On your own side, your orcs can arrive to help you in combat, saving you from a killing blow, and even betray you and revert to Sauron's side at inopportune times. Instead of simply filling the 5 warchief slots, your focus is on taking the strongholds at the centre of each zone, assaulting and defending them in massive battles, and the orcs you place in charge of the strongholds will affect its appearance. There's enough depth that you can grow attached to your own cadre of weird little guys, building them up to be more powerful, deciding which ones to put in charge. You can also end up building rivalries with your opponents, deliberately hunting down particularly irritating orcs. When it's tuned to the player's skill level, it's an excellent system that builds and encourages engagement on a personal level, even if none of your chosen orcs are going to end up being particularly important to the plot. Capturing Nirn opens access to the other locations. Cirith Ungol and Minas Ithil, now Minas Morgul, reopen to you, as well as granting you access to the plains of Gorgoroth and the frozen mountains of Saragost. The difference in visual aesthetics can be as stark as the difference between Nirn and Udun in the first game, but there's more mechanical variety between the different zones. Despite looking different, the environments of the first game were still laid out and played similarly. The sequel differentiates the locations with the way they're laid out, the connection between and density of outposts, and the overall level of verticality changing between zones to make each feel mechanically distinct as well as visually. While the first act focused on a mostly linear sequence of missions, Act 2 opens up by advancing 4 parallel sets of missions across its 5 zones, all underpinned by the ultimate goal of taking each of the strongholds. Bruce's missions at first seem to be your tutorial for the army building mechanics, and they are, but when you've taken Nirn from its current overlord, returning Weird Little Guy Ratbag, and the questline completion percentage is still very low, you should start getting suspicious. After defending the fort from Sauron's attempt to reclaim it, the huge, inexplicably Australian Olog stabs you in the back and takes it for himself. It doesn't take long to take the fort back. Ratbag helps you sneak in through his escape tunnel, but Celebrimbor refuses to accept the indignity of some orc thinking he can mutiny against the Bright Lord. So, when Bruce escapes, you hunt him down to set an example. Bruce was initially set up as a comic relief character, as is Ratbag, who accompanies you for much of this line, so it's surprising that it gets pretty dark by the end. Orcs are built to fight. Fighting is their life, and they thoroughly enjoy it. The domination technique that Celebrimbor uses is based upon fear, so when you catch up with him, you cram an intolerable amount of unmitigated fear into his head until it breaks. Bruce is left a mindless, quivering mess, babbling incoherently to himself. It's the one moment Ratbag's comedic nature actually works, because the veneer drops. He's been pretty blasé about things up till now, not being particularly perturbed by wanton slaughter and torture, keeping an upbeat attitude through everything, but what you do to Bruce is the worst thing an orc can imagine. For just a moment, he is clearly disturbed by what you've done. Celebrimbor has managed to instill genuine fear into him by making an example of Bruce, and it works best because it's such a juxtaposition from his regular personality. It's clear that Ratbag sees Talion differently afterwards. Despite being the questline most focused on the Nemesis system, its execution also goes to show the limitations of it. Ranger is a good example of this. He's another Olog and acts as Ratbag's sidekick. Much of Ratbag's involvement in the plot revolves around him wanting to free Ranger, who has been captured by Bruce. Ranger speaks only in black speech, which Ratbag doesn't understand, a fact that is used to comedic effect throughout. It's apparent that Ranger does understand the common language everyone else is speaking, but at the end he reveals he also speaks it. His only line of dialogue that doesn't need translating is to turn to Talion after seeing Bruce's fate and declaring that you are cruel. It's a simple moment, but it adds a lot to the character. I liked Ranger before. He was less overtly comedic and felt more like what I was expecting or indeed hoping for from the orcs as characters, but the reveal that his decision to speak only the black speech is an affectation is more deeply comedic than any of the other deliberately silly orcs you may encounter. Further, that moment, the combination of fear and respect, seeming to believe that the duo crossed some sort of line, the deliberate choice to ensure he was understood clearly, it's a subtlety of storytelling the Nemesis system is unable to deliver. The orcs of the Nemesis system are by necessity one note. Comedic or over-the-top elements are used to create memorable characters for you to fight against or alongside, and while it's able to create memorable sequences of events, it's incapable of true narrative depth or complexity. The quiet moments of Ratbag and Ranger's response to what has been done to Bruce adds more character to each of them than any of the procedurally generated orcs have combined, and realising that does make the captains and warlords you face feel just a little flatter than they were before. The Gondorians' questline focuses on the fates of Baranor and Idril in the wake of Minas Ithil's fall. The pair are both fighting a small-scale guerrilla war against the forces of Mordor, though with different goals. Baranor simply seeks to rescue as many of the Gondorian forces as he can before fleeing Mordor. Idril has different plans. Baranor desperately wants to leave Mordor, and more importantly, wants Idril to leave Mordor. There's an unspoken romantic bond between the two, though it's clear neither is ready to fully engage with it, especially given the circumstances. Idril, however, is incensed by Baranor's desire to see her flee Mordor. It's clear she still feels a great deal of guilt over her father's actions. In her eyes, the rise of Minas Morgul is a direct result of her father's desire to protect her above all. That guilt is a debt, and she is intent on repaying it, and she's not going to let Baranor add to that debt by taking her away from the fight when there's still a fight to be had. Ultimately, Idril wins out. Baranor abandons his plan to leave Mordor. He'll stay by Idril's side, even in the face of certain death. While the questline is the shortest of Act 2, it's an important conclusion for Talion. First, as a reminder for what he's fighting for, but more importantly as one final chance for him to act like a human, before succumbing to the inevitable corruption of power. This is the last time Talion gets to see the couple. In fact, it may be the last moments he spends amongst his fellow humans at all. Baranor reappears as the lead in his own DLC, Desolation of Mordor, but this is the last time the player sees Idril. Not necessarily the last you hear from her, however. Like the last game, Mordor is scattered with collectible artifacts, but there these objects were presented with a simple description, and a short conversation that happened near it at some point. They were disconnected from the narrative at hand, so felt superfluous. Here, each item is a piece stolen from the vaults of Minas Ithil, and is described by Idril. This makes them much more engaging to hunt down, since in addition to glimpses of parts of the world the game can't show, you get a better idea of who Idril is through how she reacts to the pieces, wondering how the people of Harad, who she's been told are savages, could create such beautiful jewellery, or speaking wistfully of her childhood as she reminisces over the books she used to read. Talion and Celebrimbor get a brief discussion of each piece as well. Talion remembering his life before, Celebrimbor usually being snide about the quality of the craftsmanship. These minor changes make collecting the artifacts far more engaging than it was in the previous game. Rather than simply feeling like a checklist activity, each one acts as a chance to not only expand the setting, but to deepen the connection to the characters as well, in much the same way collecting Shelob's memories expanded the player's understanding of her motivations. Not every character gets as much complexity, however. Kanan isn't as well integrated to the narrative as the other questlines. While the Gondorians' quests follow from the events of Act 1, Bruce's line develops from your early conquests, and Eltariel's missions will ultimately develop into the game's finale, Kanan makes herself known to the player as soon as they arrive in Nirn, but interacting with her is narratively separate from anything else going on. Her inclusion is mostly to integrate mechanical elements. Similar to Torvin, she mostly exists to justify missions focused on creatures and mounts. Unlike Torvin, she's big and green, and her accent is Icelandic rather than Scottish. I waver back and forth as to whether or not she really fits into the setting. The subtler elements feel more like a natural inclusion. Kanan is shown to be not a singular figure, but the spirit of the forest itself, able to manipulate the plants and creatures within, as well as manifest itself as great beasts both within the forest and abroad when necessary. In this form she feels like a fitting element in Tolkien's Legendarium, but when she actively speaks, as a big tree lady in front of you, it feels off somehow. The game never uses the word Entwive, though I get the feeling it was the vibe they were going for, but that's also the problem. She is simultaneously both too similar to and too different from the Ents. As a purely ethereal character, she would have been separate enough to feel appropriate, but as a singular entity, it feels too imitative of things that came before, while being too different to actually fit alongside those established elements. The restraint of not uttering the term Entwive wasn't extended to the rest of her plotline, however. It's not all that surprising that the developers decided to include a Balrog in the plot. As the biggest, baddest monster to appear in the books, it's a natural fit that you'd want to face one down here. It's more surprising that after punching it with a Graug a few times, then strafing it from a Drake a few more, you managed to drown it in a lake of ice 3 missions in, long before the end of the questline. The rest of the missions focus on the orc who first reawakened it. Zog the Eternal is another preceded orc, a necromancer. He's not particularly compelling as a villain, and predictably you kill him a few times before it finally sticks, which does give you a taste of how frustrating it must be to fight Talion and Celebrimbor and their refusal to stay dead. Zog isn't even working for Sauron. Not long after killing the Balrog, he breaks away, trying instead to build his own army of the dead to rival both you and Sauron. There is a great moment at the climax where you face down a small army made up of the resurrected corpses of captains you faced back in Minas Ithil, but for the most part there's no real connection to the player's characters or the narrative as a whole. Weirdly, Zog and Kanan are the same in that they exist to justify interaction with a specific set of mechanics. Kanan with the mounted combat, and Zog with necromancy, but this doesn't become apparent until later when the third act introduces necromancy as a power that Talion can make use of. Introducing it here does make that integration feel less jarring, but it still feels out of place in the moment. A lot of this is due to the depiction of magic in the books and films. Middle-earth has never really had what some settings would consider a magic system. The Rings of Power, for example, are vague in the powers, and it seems to change depending on who's using them. Games set in Middle-earth generally struggle with this more nebulous form of magic, with games from War in the North to Lord of the Rings Online adding more explicit magic uses instead. But even beside Talion's explicit wraith magic granted by Celebrimbor, the necromancy coming from some random orc feels wildly out of place for the setting. Magic is mostly the domain of either supernatural beings, such as Gandalf and the Astari, or very ancient elves, such as Galadriel, and even then it's shown to be powerful but not necessarily much in the way of spectacle. It feels like an ability that would have made more sense for one of the Nazgul to have. One of them does, in fact, but having another one here instead of an orc would have made the inclusion feel a little less jarring, while still setting it up mechanically for later. Instead, the Nazgul primarily make up the focus of Eltariel's missions, alongside setting up the rest of the pieces needed for Act 3. Eltariel's Nazgul hunt will have you facing down 3 of the Ringwraiths, each increasingly dangerous both to the player and to the established canon. Suladan isn't an established character in the lore, though he appears to be based upon Ar-Pharazôn, the last king of Numenor. Each defeated Sauron and captured him, each eventually came to rely on his counsel, and each faced their downfall because of this. Ar-Pharazôn went on to attempt landing upon the shores of Valinor, which resulted in the destruction of Numenor. Suladan instead was granted a Ring of Power and became a Ringwraith. He's mostly just present to establish the lore around Ringwraiths, a chance for Talion to learn that they were once men. Helm Hammerhand was a great king of Rohan. His life is detailed in the appendices of the novel. During his reign, his people faced a terrible winter, during which wild men of the mountains invaded Rohan, destroying villages and attacking the citizens. Helm retreated with his people to the Hornburg, which would later be known as Helm's Deep, and settled in for a long siege. Each night, his men would blow the great horn within the fortress, and Helm would make his way into the valley to face the wild men alone, and each morning he would return, until one morning he didn't. His people feared the worst, but on that day the blizzard lifted. The Rohirrim saw in the valley their king, standing tall facing the wild men. The sight roused them to battle, and they rode out, defeating the wild men and pushing them back from their lands. Helm was dead though, frozen solid, still standing in defiance against those who would assault his people. He is one of the most revered kings of his line, his grave speckled with snowdrops. In Shadow of War, he's made one of the Ringwraiths. This doesn't work for a lot of reasons, even beyond having an established life and death. In the game's narrative, he is ambushed in the forest and his daughter taken. Sauron and Celebrimbor come to him on his deathbed and offer him a ring, saving his life. Using the power, he assaults the people who kidnapped his daughter, but accidentally kills her in the fray and goes on to slaughter everyone in the room. How much this rewrite bugs you is a very personal matter. I don't particularly mind the rewriting of his life and death. Weaker though the new elements are, minimising his achievements and emphasising his anger and physical strength do make for a more threatening enemy. I also don't mind that it doesn't work from a timeline perspective. Helm was born midway through the Third Age, about 1,000 years after Sauron was defeated by the last alliance of elves and men, when Isildur cut the One Ring from his hand. Some 1,500 years after the fall of Numenor, when Sauron lost his ability to take on a fair form, and some 2,000 years after the Nazgul were first established. But what I mind most about it is that Helm Hammerhand wields a hammer. Helm's epithet comes from the fact that when he left Helm's Deep each night, he did so unarmed. He fought the wild men each night with his bare fists, hence the title Hammer Hand. It's not that giving him a hammer is different from the established lore. I don't mind them changing established lore. The problem is, by knowing the lore, I can see an opportunity for a far better version of things. Helm's story is more compelling in the Legendarium than it is here, but even if they'd changed everything else, by removing the unarmed element to his character, they removed the chance for a Nazgul to suplex Talion through a table. An unarmed ringwraith that fights with his bare fists could have been a great spectacle, but instead the hammer makes him feel kinda bland. It's not that the lore has been changed, it's the loss of what could have been if the lore had been better adhered to. That said, taken on its own merits, without knowledge of who Helm was, it's not terrible. Though his inclusion is mostly filler, time to better get to know Eltariel before facing down the more important of the three. The Nazgul in general, both the named and unnamed, are far less interesting than in the films. There's two major reasons for this, even beyond the fact that they're a lot simpler to fight than even mid-level orc captains. The more armoured designs, including different helmets for the named ones, make the wraiths feel more corporeal, less mysterious and sinister, despite their otherworldly glow and partial transparency. The other problem is how talkative they are. The ringwraiths will talk at length when an encounter begins, taunting Talion in much the same way the orcs do, which makes them feel far less unknowable or different. It's a small thing, but it makes what should be an imposing series of enemies feel far less threatening than they deserve. Helm is obscure enough that him being a Nazgul wouldn't seem weird to people with a more casual familiarity with the setting, but Isildur being a ringwraith seems like even they would start to notice some inaccuracies. That said, his inclusion is better than Helm's, since despite the even more extreme changes to the lore, those changes are in service of the game's overarching plot. Isildur's body was captured after his death, turned with the ring against his will. Now he's a necromancer, raising the ghosts of the Gondorian defenders of Minas Ithil to face Talion. The narrative escalation between the Nazgul works well, Suladan to establish that they were men corrupted by the rings, Helm to establish that Celebrimbor was present during their distribution, and finally Isildur to create a stronger connection with Talion. Seeing a great king of Gondor brought under the control of Sauron is devastating to Talion, and seeing how Celebrimbor helped, even if he claims unintentionally, builds an increasingly adversarial relationship between the two. Having completed the four main quest lines, and capturing the strongholds of Nirn, Cirith Ungol, Saragost and Gorgoroth, the march on Barad-dûr begins. The fight along the bridge has you facing increasing number of orcs, including many of the captains you'd faced up until now, before finally confronting Isildur. This is where the tenuous alliance between Talion and Celebrimbor ends. Celebrimbor's increasing arrogance and lust for power throughout builds to a head when he attempts to dominate the defeated ringwraith. Talion refuses to make his kinsman a slave and kills Isildur instead. Celebrimbor is furious. His plan has been to dominate Sauron, not simply defeat him all along, and it seems Talion may not be on board with this plan anymore. To him, Talion was only ever a vessel for his power, and it's time for that vessel to be tossed aside. Celebrimbor takes the new ring and offers it to Eltariel instead. Eltariel, who has been fighting the Nazgul to a stalemate for years, accepts it. It's the major flaw with the plot, in my opinion. Despite spending time with her during her missions, you never get to know her very well. She's always been a little more ruthless than Talion, but she respects him. Celebrimbor is far more ruthless still, but Eltariel has never shown anything but distrust for him. Deciding to side with him to dominate Sauron at this final juncture feels short-sighted and out of what little character has been established till now. I still like her as a character, but a lot of that is because she's a cool lady with a sword and I'm a simple man. Regardless, by accepting the ring, Celebrimbor releases Talion from his hold, and the gaping neck wound he earned all the way back at the Black Gate reopens. Eltariel leaves him to die, with some sense of regret, and faces Sauron beside Celebrimbor. Talion's war is far from over though. Celebrimbor may have discarded him, but for Shelob, he's still her best piece in play, and it's time for her closing move. In a final vision, as he lies dying, Shelob reveals the truth to him. She didn't grant him visions to defeat Sauron, not solely. The future she was fighting against was one where Talion and Celebrimbor faced him together. In that future they defeated Sauron, and Celebrimbor inherited his armies, his powers, and his ambition. The new Bright Lord marched across all Middle-earth, imposing his order across all. By pushing Talion towards Minas Ithil, reminding him of his connection with Gondor, adding just that little extra friction between the two, she was able to break them apart, and with the two separated, this future will not come to pass. Talion still has a role to play in this one, however, but it requires one last sacrifice on his part. With his dying breath, he takes up Isildur's ring and places it upon his finger. Reborn as a ringwraith, but still in control for now, Talion marches on Minas Morgul to reclaim it from the Witch King. With the necromancy powers inherited from Isildur's ring, it feels like an impressive jump in power, despite being only a minimal mechanical shift. Celebrimbor and Eltariel fail in their assault on Sauron. At the last second, Sauron is able to cut the ring from Eltariel's hand, at which point he and Celebrimbor are locked in an attempt to dominate one another. Together they are trapped, the amalgam of the Bright Lord and the Dark Lords taking on the form of a great flaming eye atop Barad-dûr. The corrupting influence of power is a major component in the narratives of Middle-earth, so this fits in well thematically, even if it is a slightly clumsy way of rolling back the decision to have Sauron appear in person several times. Celebrimbor's lust for power, his desire to bring order to Middle-earth through dominance, ultimately makes him no different from Sauron. Between Celebrimbor and Talion, you get a glimpse of what may have become of Gandalf or Galadriel had they taken the ring for themselves when Frodo offered. Meanwhile, Talion is equally doomed, despite his attempt to use the Ringwraith's power for good. While breaking the pair apart was Shelob's plan to stop Celebrimbor's ascent, Talion becoming a Ringwraith and claiming Minas Morgul is her move to defeat Sauron. Talion will inevitably fall to corruption, will march on Middle-earth alongside the Witch King, but until he falls he can hold the line. By ensuring a constant conflict between Talion and the forces of Sauron in Mordor, the tides are held back, and time is bought for Middle-earth. Eltariel took the ring to try and end her stalemate against the Nazgul, but it was she herself who said that sometimes in the fight against evil, a stalemate is a victory. The Shadow War takes place in the post-game, an endless chance to defend and capture strongholds, but before discussing that, it's worth looking at the 2 DLC campaigns released for the game. As the name would suggest, Blade of Galadriel focuses on Eltariel's Nazgul hunt. Galadriel appears in visions to provide guidance, though she's much harder than the film's depiction. It's clear that she thinks highly of Eltariel, but shows it through tough love. She's also just a little narked about the whole taking the new ring and working with Celebrimbor thing. What's done is done though, and with Celebrimbor and Sauron locked together in the eye above Barad-dûr, Eltariel is pointed towards Minas Morgul to seek the Nazgul who resides there. Talion is of course not a Nazgul quite yet, and after a brief confrontation is pretty welcoming, given that both the first and last times he met Eltariel she tried to murder him. He recruits her to join him in the Shadow War against the forces of Mordor. It's implied that there's been considerable time passed between the end of Shadow of War's main campaign and now, though the exact chronology is unclear. Eltariel's presence serves 2 purposes for Talion. Firstly, he's beginning to feel the corruption of Isildur's ring seeping in, so it's good to keep the Nazgul hunter closer for when he finally falls. And secondly, the war has taken a turn for the worse recently, though the cause is as of yet unknown. Eltariel plays differently from Talion. The new ring makes her more powerful than she was, but despite her willingness to allow Celebrimbor to dominate Sauron, or perhaps because of the outcome of that plan, she refuses to use it to dominate orcs. This means in most instances you'll be fighting alone, so to balance this, Eltariel has access to a more effective series of crowd control tools to deal with larger groups of orcs. The light of Galadriel allows her to blind foes, stunning them and opening them up to instant executions, and much of the combat focuses on ways to inflict and spread this between groups. She's a lot more effective against groups of basic grunts, but has less tools to exploit the weaknesses of captains, making dealing with them through environmental means more important. You aren't always alone, however. Working with Talion means working with his orcs, and each of the new captains you encounter throughout the DLC are pre-designed individuals like Ranger and Bruce. Like those, this allows for more detailed characterization of each, though due to the length of the plot and the number of captains, you don't get to spend a great deal of time with any of them. Akoth, Slayer of the Dead, for example, he's a competent and trusted war chief in Talion's horde. He's also quite obviously terrified of Talion while explaining what happened to all the other captains to leave Cirith Ungol so poorly defended. You don't get a great deal more interaction with him beyond the first mission you meet him, and it's the same with all the others. They get more detailed, more unique characterizations than the captains at the base game, but usually only get one mission to introduce themselves, though they're still pretty flat. They also lean more on the comedic side of things, some more than others, though all to some degree. Characters like Archaeus the Architect, an Olog obsessed with building an impenetrable underground fortress who is visually designed to evoke Leonardo da Vinci, or Flint and Tinder, a pair of brothers who love booms. My personal favourite is unsurprisingly one of the more serious of the captains. Og, the Bow of Morgoth, has to be one of the oldest orcs in existence. It's said the orcs were first formed through Morgoth's corruption of the elves, and Og appears to be one of these earliest orcs, smarter and more eloquent than the more savage Uruks around him. The marksman fought alongside the first Dark Lord in the War of Wrath, and he's not going to put up with some upstart pretender like Sauron claiming the title. He agrees to side with Eltariel after she proves both her skills with a bow and her willingness to help fight against this second-rate wannabe. Which does bring up one of the weirdest inclusions to the narrative, with Eltariel refusing to use the new ring for domination, and Talion off dealing with other threats. None of the allied captains are forced into service. They all agree to work with you for their own reasons. It suddenly introduces a huge moral quandary to the series that it had otherwise been skirting around up until now. When the orcs were mindless warmongers, controlled by fear, it made sense to dominate them with the ring. Ratrag felt like more of an exception made earlier on, but now you can staff an entire stronghold with orcs rallied through diplomacy. It makes Talion, Celebrimbor and Sauron seem even more monstrous for their actions. They even prove capable of complex reasoning and planning. The focus is on assaulting the four fortresses again, but without an army, you have to take them through more underhanded means. Maku the Fixer helps develop these plans and introduces you to others who can help you, mostly to help get revenge against the orc captains he helped take the forts in the first place, then stiffed him on the payment. The game treating orcs as more than just mindless enemies was always going to lead to this, but it's in Blade of Galadriel that the possibility for the orcs to be something more complex finally overflows, and the result highlights the moral questions about whether or not using the orcs in the way you have is permissible from an ethical viewpoint. Not that the game is interested in examining such questions, which isn't unfair. The point seems to be to make each captain more unique than the last, have each one stand out more, but as a result the tone ends up being a bit all over the place. Trying to take seriously the threat of the orcs when you know they're a bunch of silly little goobers undermines the darker tone that Shadow of Mordor started out with. The main villains of the piece do manage to maintain that tone, however. The Nazgul sisters, Nazgirls if you will, though you probably shouldn't, don't get a huge amount of stage time unfortunately, but what they do get is memorable. In the 80s there was a tabletop RPG based on The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. I've never been big on playing tabletop RPGs myself, being too antisocial to really enjoy them, but I do love looking through sourcebooks such as monster manuals and campaign settings. The books that always fascinated me the most with the Middle-earth role-playing game, or MERP for short, were the few books set well beyond the bounds of Tolkien's writing. Tolkien did a great deal of world building, far beyond what's strictly necessary, but even his expansive style has its limits. The development of fictional worlds always leaves some areas left less developed, fuzzier than others, eventually receding into negative space, and when it comes to expanded lore, I've always been more interested in what various writers and designers fill those spaces with, rather than simply revisiting and retreading old ground. The Shadow of games have dwelt mostly in the fuzzy areas, referenced briefly drawn on maps but never explicitly discussed by Tolkien's writings. The Nazgul sisters hail from a land far beyond the eastern border of Mordor, a place called Shen that doesn't appear upon any map or within any writings of Tolkien. Personally, I'm very fond of Shen conceptually. What little you glimpse of the land in flashbacks is clearly based on Chinese history, a tad trite given the deliberate attempts by Peter Jackson's films to distance foreign cultures such as Harad from any real-world counterparts, but understandable shorthand for a place that appears for roughly 1 minute in one cutscene, and relatively fitting given the legendarium. Arda is vaguely analogous to Earth itself, with Middle-earth representing the European continent, so it fits that to the far east would be an area roughly analogous to Asia. I'm also personally rather fond of Chinese history, architecture and aesthetics, so the idea of a Middle-earth rendition of China does appeal to me. Of course, others are free to disagree. Merp had a different view of what existed within the negative space of Tolkien's world, others have different views still. Middle-earth being fictional, obviously, though perhaps controversially, means that no one person's view of what exists within it is any more true than anyone else's, and discussions and arguments over the one true canon are fundamentally pointless in my view. While I'm not always a fan of the diversions, these games' willingness to stray from canon, to develop their own versions of the world, suited to their own stories being told, is something that appeals to me about them, though I recognise others will disagree with that. Like Talion, the sisters were not the original owners of their respective rings. They travelled from their homeland on their own Nazgul hunt, defeating two and returning with the rings. They refused to relinquish them, however, killing their father, the ruler of their land, and usurping his throne instead. Using the rings they became wealthy and powerful, but ultimately succumbed to their corruption, before returning to Mordor with Sauron. Now, with Sauron stuck atop Barad-dûr with Celebrimbor, and the Witch King temporarily out of action after being ousted from Minas Morgul by Talion, the ladies are making a power grab in Mordor itself. With some more time and more stage presence, they could have been developed into a pair of very compelling villains. As it is, more time is taken up on recruiting the new orc captains, so their role is limited to taunting the player a couple of times, and then a boss fight against the two towards the end. They aren't the final boss, mind you, that would be Talion. Having retaken the forts, he finally feels the power of the ring overtaking him. Eltariel moves to kill him, but has enough respect for the man that she allows them to return to Minas Morgul first, so that Talion can spend his final moments on Gondorian soil. The ending of Blade of Galadriel does diverge slightly from the ending depicted at the end of the Shadow Wars, though only in the fine details. The differences mainly focus on which protagonist is being followed, and before we talk about the ending, we've got another DLC to talk about. Desolation of Mordor adds an entirely new area to the game. The desert canyons of Lithlad are as gorgeous as any of the other locations, and its addition to the base campaign adds some extra variety to your stronghold capturing, though there's no story content to be had in that regard. Its mini-campaign does have some story, but the DLC is more mechanically focused than Blades of Galadriel, so narrative content is limited, which is a shame because I really like what they were doing with it. This time you take on the role of Baranor, separated from Idril since leaving the base game, though she's still alive out there somewhere. Baranor has travelled to Lithlad in the hopes of finding a mercenary group active in the area and enlisting them to assault the fortress there. Things don't go to plan, of course, and his squad is eaten by sandworms, with him only being saved by the intervention of the dwarven hunter Torvin. Torvin gets little more than a cameo role in the DLC, appearing at the start and end, being relegated to a source of skill upgrades in between. He provides Baranor with the gear that will make up his mechanical skill set for the fights ahead, then sends him on his way to find the mercenary company. Unlike Talion and Eltariel, Baranor is a simple man without a ring of power. This means he is perilously mortal and will die permanently if you let him. Your progress across the 5 campaign missions, as well as the skills you get from them and Torvin, are maintained between runs, but any mercenaries you hire, captains you kill, or outposts you liberate are reset upon death. Once the campaign is done, it acts as a challenge mode, a time trial to see how quickly you can capture the stronghold without dying. Shadow of Mordor had something similar in a series of ranked modes letting you take on various numbers of war chiefs as fast as possible, but Shadow of War eschewed that in favour of the endless sieges instead. The single life does make it very challenging, however, and I'll admit I had to drop the difficulty back down to normal to succeed. Baranor's skill set lends itself to a more hit-and-run focused set of tactics. The Numenorian artifact he procures from Torvin, a combination shield, grappling hook and crossbow, combined with a reusable parachute, make him even more mobile than the other protagonists, able to escape a fight quickly. Meanwhile, his reliance on consumables makes every fight something of a timed affair. It's much easier to inflict poison and flame attacks on enemies with the bolts and bombs you acquire, and you can heal far quicker and more easily with health kits, but both are limited, and only the basic crossbow bolts can be reliably regained during a fight, so prolonged conflict is ill-advised. It does make for a fun change of pace. By the end of Shadow of War, you were more or less able to carve your way through entire armies alone, so this reliance on consumables, but being able to quickly extricate yourself from a fight gone wrong, feels more like the earlier portions of Shadow of Mordor, where stealth and planning were more important. Like Eltariel, Baranor can't dominate orcs, so instead he hires mercenaries from the Vanishing Sons. The mercenaries have far less visual distinction from one another than the orcs, but they still run on the same system of varying skills and abilities, and it's a clear indication that the Nemesis system could be adapted to humans. The mercenaries can act as your bodyguards, but they also protect the outposts you capture, and act as your supporters when you finally assault the stronghold. They're headed up by a man named Circa the Unkillable, Circa the Insufferable, Circa the Survivor, and, as it would turn out, Circa the long-lost brother of Baranor. The two were separated when they were young, both were born to Haradrim parents in Umbar, and grew up together, but while Baranor was sent to be raised in Gondor as a gesture of peace, Circa was captured when his village was raided and grew up amongst the mercenaries. When developing the Peter Jackson films, the team ran into a problem when designing the Haradrim, who hailed from the deserts south of Mordor. They initially designed them to look African, but realised that simply making a race of dark-skinned evil men was probably a really bad idea. They pivoted to include elements of South American, Middle Eastern and Asian influences as well, leading to the less specific but more original designs featured in the films. Meanwhile, the Easterlings, men of Rhûn, a land north of Mordor, were equipped with ornate golden armour. Unfortunately, there was always some confusion around differentiating the two groups in the films, and even in the books they are little mentioned. In the Middle-earth role-playing game, Harad was interpreted in much the same way as Western interpretations of tales such as the Arabian Nights or the Voyages of Sinbad, swashbuckling adventures with curved swords and turbans. Circa's mercenaries managed to combine all three of these elements into a single group, but it works pretty well. Their dress is a combination of Easterling and Haradrim designs from the film, meanwhile they're motivated, Circa especially, as much by the excitement of rip-roaring adventure as the coin they'll earn doing so. This slightly lighter, more adventurous tone across the board, combined with the orcs being pushed into the background, lead to the most tonally consistent of the experiences thus far. Both the more comedic and Dasper aspects are being reduced, but they still fit better with the pulpier ideals being brought about by working alongside Circa. It's a shame there isn't more of it, really. It's clear that most of the development time on the DLC went into developing the new zone and building out the mercenaries to add to the Nemesis system, both of which are great additions, but this leaves the narrative to feel somewhat rushed. The relationship between Circa and Baranor has a natural and fun chemistry to it. Seeing how their different upbringings shape them into different, but fundamentally similar men, and seeing them get to know one another again is compelling, but it's all limited to just a handful of missions, shorter than any of the quest lines in the main campaign. More time spent with them would have been welcome. That's not to say the mechanical engagement is bad, mind you. Outposts felt like something of a vestigial feature in the base game, so making them necessary to taking the forts and levelling your character in the meantime does integrate them nicely. They also escalate in difficulty as well, each change to a miniature version of the final siege, with each one adding additional low-level captains and more defences to be dealt with. Meanwhile, the permadeath nature does make forward planning and strategizing more important. In the base game you could throw yourself at an enemy with reckless abandon, but here you do have to consider your fights more carefully. Ultimately though, I'm somewhat more drawn to narrative content than challenge modes, and if I feel like taking a fort as a one-off, I'm far more likely to jump into the endless sieges instead, leaving Desolation of Mordor feeling a little anemic at times. What it does show, however, is potential. It's proof that the Nemesis system can support more than just orcs, that it can mix not only other allies or enemies into it, but expand to new systems of engagement with it. Furthermore, it shows that it can be used as a basis for a mix of narrative and mechanically focused experiences, even if overall, Desolation never gets the balance quite right for my tastes. In theory, the Shadow Wars that act as Shadow of War's epilogue are a great idea. Shadow of Mordor let you continue into the post-game, but there wasn't much reason to do so beyond finishing the last few challenges. There was no structure to it. Shadow of War's post-game takes the form of an escalating sequence of defences and assaults on the strongholds of Mordor. Each stage selects one or more strongholds to be defended. If you succeed in defending them all, you pass on to the next stage. If you fail, you need to retake the stronghold in the same manner you did during Act 2, building up your captains and hunting down their war chiefs. The assaults were some of the largest fights during the regular campaign, but the defensive missions are even larger still. Without the ability to thin the enemy ranks beforehand, you face down a huge number of captains at a time, and pulling through by the skin of your teeth is a satisfying struggle. Win or lose, the assault is likely to reduce your forces considerably, either freeing up space to fill with stronger orcs for your response, or to make the next assault harder still. The flaw in the system is that the enemy captains become too powerful too quickly. Early in the game, you regularly meet captains that can be killed instantly in some way. As the game progresses, they gain more resistances and have fewer vulnerabilities. By the time you're a few stages into the Shadow Wars, captains will regularly have a huge slew of resistances, making them very difficult to actually damage at all. A captain you can't vault over, who's immune to executions, ranged attacks in your ice style and carries a shield, is very difficult to deal with, and once they start stacking multiple orcs with similarly long lists of immunities, the fights begin to drag a great deal. Encounters stop feeling like an engaging fight or a puzzle to be solved, and instead become an attempt to find one cheese strat that works and abuse it. It's not a strictly endless sequence. You can continue to take and hold strongholds for as long as you want, but it does eventually lead to an ending cutscene. In the game as it exists now, you see it after the third stage, but when the game launched, you had to drag your way through 10 whole stages of these increasingly difficult fights to see it. Alongside that change, the patch also reduced what was originally a huge jump in difficulty to the slightly more gradual increase in captain's levels that's present now. The reason for these changes, or perhaps to be more accurate, the reason it was originally a bigger jump in difficulty and a longer grind to the ending cutscene, is because when the game launched, you could purchase new orc captains, upgrades, and gear through microtransactions. To be fair to the developers, this was patched out around 6 months after launch, openly admitting it undermined the game. As it exists now, you'd be forgiven for not being able to tell these microtransactions were ever an option, but knowing that they were does start to show areas in which their existence may have affected the structure of the game considerably. Giving Talion something of a happy ending after all this does slightly undermine the narrative of the corrupting influence of power. But after suffering through decades of fighting in Mordor, followed by being subjugated by the Witch King and marching on his homeland, he's sacrificed enough, and I'm glad to see it. Whether he fights Altariel or not, Talion does become one of the Ring Wraiths, but when the One Ring is destroyed, he's freed from the influence, ultimately being free to finally die and reunite with his family. However, Celebrimbor's spirit escapes from the Eye as Barad-dûr falls. Just a visual indication at the end of the Shadow Wars, but Blade of Galadriel expanded upon this explicitly, stating his spirit escaped to the east. Eltariel was meant to travel to the Undying Lands with the rest of her kind, but instead she decides to start a new hunt for the Ringmaker. The ending of Blade of Galadriel and its boss fight against Talion make it clear Eltariel is being set up as the protagonist for a sequel, likely in the uncharted Eastern Lands with Celebrimbor as the antagonist. Meanwhile, Desolation of Mordor showed that you wouldn't even have to restrict yourself to orcs within the Nemesis system. The possibility for Eltariel to be gathering elves, men and dwarves as allies and enemies in her fight against Celebrimbor and the lands beyond the maps of Tolkien is an enticing one. As much as I'd be excited for this though, it's no longer going to happen. Despite having a strong history of releases, Shadow of War would be Monolith Productions' final game. They would be shut down by their parent company Warner Bros. Games in 2025. Despite this shutdown, Warner Bros. Entertainment also patented the Nemesis system in 2016, a patent which currently won't expire until 2036, so even the underlying concept can't be used by another studio in another setting, at least not without licensing it from Warner Bros. Or whoever ends up owning Warner Bros. After Netflix and Paramount are done fighting over it. Meanwhile, rights to games based on The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit are now held by the Embracer Group. While the ultimate outcome of this will only be known in the fullness of time, for now the number of layoffs Embracer have been declaring in recent years don't paint an optimistic outlook for the future of Middle-earth in games. It's easy to point at the two games and complain about their inadherence to canon. I have in this video, I have before, and probably shall again, but it's important to recognise that this doesn't detract from their quality. Elements such as Shelob, Helm, and Isildur can be narratively or thematically off base with the source material, but if they're well used in the context of the work, it's not really a problem. My complaints about the lore are less to do with it being inaccurate, and more to do with the feeling that it could have been better by incorporating what I see as more impactful elements than what ended up present, such as with Helm. But this is only a problem if you're already deeply familiar with the source material, and more importantly, it doesn't detract from that source material. There is a common refrain when works diverge from their existing canon in both major and minor ways, that the works are somehow a betrayal of the fans, or of the original works and their creators, that they have somehow ruined those original works. I reject this claim outright. Lord of the Rings, whether the books or the Peter Jackson films, are absolute titans of their respective mediums. Nothing these two games, or indeed any of the post-Tolkien expanded lore surrounding Middle-earth, is going to be bad enough to affect that. In fact, it wouldn't matter how bad the works were, how egregious the diversions, those works aren't affected by what comes after. The works may be connected, but they are still separate. The works of Tolkien and the expanded Legendarium aren't changed by works like these, and it's unfair to both to claim that they are somehow ruining what came before. It's unfair to the new work because it's not engaging with it on its own terms, and it's unfair to the originals because it implies that a lesser known work released decades after the original could somehow affect how meaningful and impactful the originals were. It's important to allow works to exist on their own terms, and to judge them on their own merits, and not just because forcing every discussion of a work to be a comparison to what came before flattens the work and limits creativity. The Peter Jackson films vary from the books in many ways. To prioritise those differences de-emphasises so much of what those films did well. But it's also important to remember that while Tolkien wrote the original works, these games were made by people as well. It's easy to flatten a development team to a studio or a publisher and not think about it, but it's important to remember that these works are shaped by the hard work and individual decisions of dozens, if not hundreds, of people. People like Michael Forgey. Mike was an executive producer at Monolith Productions. He worked on Shadow of Mordor but died in 2016 before Shadow of War's release. He is, however, commemorated within the game in two ways. The first is Forthog, a mysterious orc who steps in to save Talion from a death blow occasionally when no one else is around. The second takes place in the credits. Between Monolith's internal credits and the extended studio and publisher credits is a tribute to Mike, featuring music from his band and photos from across his life. It's clear that Mike meant a great deal to the development team at Monolith. Writing about him, quote, "Mike Forthog Forgey was our executive producer and our great friend here at Monolith. We lost Mike to cancer during the development of Shadow of War, and we want to remember and honour him with a little bit of immortality in Mordor. The legendary Forthog Orc Slayer is our way to remember Mike as he lived, always ready to leap into the fray and save the game whenever and wherever he was most needed." End quote. It's a touching memorial, and an important reminder that there are countless people behind these works. Mike was just one person that worked on these games. His tribute takes up 4 of the 45 minutes of credits present. Each name on that list was of course a person with their own life and their own ideas of what the game should be, and it is the culmination of all of these people that created the works before us now. These people are real, Middle-earth is not. I'd argue that their lives, their ideas, their freedom to develop and create in ways they best see fit is more important to the quality of a work than adhering to the minutiae established in a fictional setting before, no matter how impactful and well regarded that setting might be, especially since doing so doesn't stop anyone from returning to that earlier material if they so choose. It's easy to point to the way the games stray from canon, easy to say where you think they aren't as good as what came before, easy to complain when the games aren't what you wanted them to be. We shouldn't do that though. To consider the games on their own merits is to respect the work that came before, and all the people who contributed to them. The games are good, in a lot of ways, mechanically and narratively, despite thematic and narrative diversions from the works that inspired it. It's a shame this team won't be able to continue working together in future. They're not always the games I wanted them to be. They don't always make the choices I wanted them to make. But at the end of the day, I hope they're the games that all those people from Monolith Productions, and the support studios beyond that, wanted to make. Whether or not they are, every one of them should be proud of the work they did on these games, and I wish them luck in the future. Thanks for watching.